In the modern iteration of the Dragon Ball franchise, Dragon Ball Super is the most popular entry out of them all. Starting in the year 2015, it followed suit from the Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods and Resurrection F movies, which began what many consider to be the Dragon Ball Renaissance, or in other words, a kind of revival and rebirth of the popularity and the prominence of the Dragon Ball franchise, which had really concluded back in the year 1995 with the Dragon Ball Manga, but then went on to be a little bit longer due to the Dragon Ball Z anime and, of course, the first continuation, Dragon Ball GT. In talking about Dragon Ball GT, it's certainly a series that has a lot of detractors over the years, in large part because of the fact that many people consider it to be non-canon, or rather that it does not actually fit within the current continuity or the prime continuity in canon of the Dragon Ball story. But whereas Dragon Ball GT has been relegated by many fans as being that non-canon spin-off off to the side, Dragon Ball Super is one that continues to thrive in fans' minds, bringing many people back to the franchise due to nostalgia and, of course, an excitement over new content finally being added to the story. But what if I told you that Dragon Ball Super itself is not actually canon, or rather does not belong to the same continuity as the true Dragon Ball Prime canon, the number one highest level of canon in the hierarchy? Well, that's exactly what I'm going to be explaining to you in this video, because I believe that all of the evidence that I've compiled over the years of thinking about this topic, getting deeply into the Dragon Ball canon and continuity, has come to this one realization, that Dragon Ball Super itself is not truly canon to the franchise in the way that it's being promoted by Toei, by Shueisha, and even by the involvement of the original creator of Dragon Ball, Akira Toriyama. So basically, I'm going to run through the different reasons as to why this is, beginning with the historical version, talking about the actual history of the Dragon Ball franchise, its beginnings, and where it ended up today, as well as other in-universe and out-of-universe rationale, which will give you a better argument or a better understanding of my argument going forward. So let's begin with the actual historical version, or the historical reasoning and rationale behind this. Of course, Dragon Ball began in its first truest form as the Dragon Ball Manga, created by Akira Toriyama starting in the year 1984, a great year when it comes to movies and cinema in general. Of course, one of Toriyama's biggest influences was also created that year by James Cameron in The Terminator, something that would go on to have a lot of influence in the Red Ribbon Army and, of course, the Cell Saga. But getting back to the actual Dragon Ball story itself, it ran from the year 1984 all the way up to the year 1995, being roughly about 11 years of time that Akira Toriyama spent writing that story. And during that time, the Dragon Ball manga and story eclipsed everything beginning with Goku meeting Bulma at the start of the story, to the very end of Goku flying off with Oob, all in one continuous story that was released weekly, more or less, with a few breaks in between for health reasons and holidays and other things like that Akira Toriyama created largely by himself, writing and illustrating a chapter every single week, not to mention also at the same time he was working on things like Dragon Quest and a number of other projects. That really goes to show you that Toriyama not only had a massive amount of involvement in the Dragon Ball story at that time, but it really goes to show you just how underrated sometimes people, have him as being, because oftentimes people say, oh, Toriyama isn't a very good writer, or he's been so eclipsed by other mangaka in the past. But again, Toriyama was doing so much, and he went on to influence so many of the manga and the anime that we have today. But during that period of time, that was all what Akira Toriyama refers to as Dragon Ball. And of course, that is the true version, being the manga, that everything else in the franchise would go on to be based on. Anytime there was an adaptation, like for example, Dragon Ball the anime and then Dragon Ball Z the anime, it was all based upon the one continuous Dragon Ball manga that was running during those 11 years. Everything that happened over that course of time is a part of the true primary canon as a result, because all of it stems stemmed not only from the creator Akira Toriyama, of course with some help from assistants and editors giving some insight or of course giving their suggestions along the way, particularly Torishima, who at points wasn't even Toriyama's editor anymore, and yet he respected him so much he made a number of major changes during the Cell Saga. All of that is ultimately Akira Toriyama's true essence of the franchise, if you will. Much like in many other stories that began and then went on to spawn larger cinematic universes and franchises and even more popular adaptations like Lord of the Rings and the Tolkien Legendarium as a whole, in which that case, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books, the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, things like that, are the true canon. And again, the adaptations, be it the movies, even if they're more popular and seen by more people, are ultimately going to be the thing that is still going to be a secondary level of canon as a result. The same thing goes for, say, Star Wars. We have the original trilogy, which were largely created by George Lucas, and everything else that spawned from that, be it the books, the comics, and you can even argue the other movies to an extent, are still not a part of the same level of canon as that original trilogy, because when it comes down to these stories ultimately, if you strip everything away to its foundation, that foundation which everything builds upon is ultimately the truest and highest level of canon, and everything else goes kind of downward in a descending slope or hierarchy of canon. So in the case of Dragon Ball, what we have is the manga being the primary canon. The adaptations in the animes and the spin-offs and the TV specials, the movies, all of those things are of a lower level of canon from up here, the Dragon Ball manga. And then down here in another level, you have the Dragon Ball guides and extra materials. Because one of the things that I have come to see, and so many other fans in this franchise have come to see who have really researched into this, is that despite the fact that so many people hold everything in these little guidebooks and these little interviews with Akira Toriyama as being the true canon or, being at the exact same level as the manga, the truth of the matter is that many of them have various contradictions, and you can argue that Toriyama's involvement in them at all is kind of dubious, because the thing is, again, we can compare Toriyama to George Lucas in many ways about how the franchise has gone about. Where in the Star Wars canon, there were all these different books and these different guides and things came out that George Lucas kind of okayed, that he said, oh yeah, these are a part of the story, these are a part of the canon. But even then, George Lucas had very little involvement in it. And there are examples of him talking about, let's say, the Thrawn trilogy, and saying that he still didn't really consider it to be the same level of canon as his original trilogy, and had considered at one point making them into live-action movies so that they could fit within that same canon. Of course, getting into Star Wars, many people consider the prequels the same level of canon as the original trilogy, and they were created by George Lucas, so you can make an argument there. But much like with Dragon Ball Super, it did happen many, many years later, which I'll explain why that actually is kind of a detriment to considering it canon soon. But in terms of the guides, Toriyama himself barely had any involvement in them. Aside from maybe checking over them briefly and then sending back his okay, there was barely anything substantive that Toriyama himself actually wrote down and contributed, other than things like the interviews, the Q&As, and stuff that we specifically see in these guides as being said from Akira Toriyama himself. But even then, that becomes an issue, because as we know, not only do the guides have contradictions, like for example, one of the Daizenshus says that Gohan was a Super Saiyan when fighting Deborah. The next one says that he was a Super Saiyan too. Another one says that Supreme Kai was stronger than Piccolo. Another one says that Piccolo threw the fight simply because Supreme Kai was of a higher divine order in the hierarchy, and of course he understood that based on having fused with Kami in the past. So ultimately, I think that when you actually look at it, you see that so many of those contradictions add up outside of what Toriyama says. But then when you actually get into what Toriyama said himself, you start to see that there also is an even bigger issue here. Because as Dragon Ball fans, as people have actually researched this on and off for years, we know though, that Akira Toriyama himself is not necessarily the best in terms of reliability when it comes to his memory. Because as Toriyama himself has said over the years, he doesn't have the best memory. He is someone who is oftentimes not really looking backward on what he did, but rather thinks in a forward-moving motion, in terms of not only his writing style, but in his life. And as a result, typically, he doesn't really like to go back and reread things he's done. He doesn't like to check the continuity to make sure it's 100% accurate, and he doesn't even try to remember a lot of the things that he did in the past, be it in Dragon Ball Z, or even what he's doing right now in Dragon Ball Super, which has really shown in all of the interviews and Q&As he's done over the years, where he's either gone out of his way to include new information that either never appeared in the manga or in the anime, or has directly contradicted himself. Like, for example, with the Supreme Kais. There's a number of times that we've heard things that are related to the divine hierarchy, which in and of themselves do not actually line up with what he said in the past. Like, how long do the Supreme Kais live? Did they live for millions of years, or did they live for tens of thousands of years? How were they chosen for their positions? Do the fruits just grow and they automatically go there, or are they chosen by a lottery, like he said before? Was Majin Buu somebody who always existed since time immemorial? Or, like in the manga, they specifically say that Majin Buu was created by an accident when Bobbity's father, was doing some kind of spell. So ultimately, you have all these contradictions not only to Toriyama's original manga, but also to the actual Dragon Ball Z anime that so many people have seen and, haven't even read the manga themselves. I mean, I've done polls on this very channel where people have told me that, at least 50% of my viewers have not actually read the manga. And I'm assuming that if we were to bring that out to the majority of people on the earth who have seen Dragon Ball, chances are they probably haven't read the manga either. So that starts to lower and lower even more. So when Toriyama is not only contradicting his own manga that he himself wrote, but also the anime equivalent of it, or the anime adaptation of it, then therein lies the problem that Toriyama himself is not really reliable, either when it comes to his original narrative intention, or when it comes to keeping his continuity inside of his mind. And that's one of the things that has always kind of bothered me a little bit when it comes to the Dragon Ball interviews and the Dragon Ball manga and all this other stuff, because the fact that people don't really seem to challenge him enough when it comes to this stuff. Pretty much every single interview Toriyama is given is like a puff piece snowball kind of interview, where they don't really, actually push him on anything for the most part, and typically it's kind of like, well, thank you for allowing us to interview you, Toriyama-sensei. We are honored to be in your presence. And again, I can understand that because when you really think about it, Toriyama is, of course, one of the most influential and important manga writers of all time, someone who, in and of himself, has done a lot of great and legendary things within his particular work. However, with that being said, I feel like sometimes people need to challenge writers and authors that much more, because as a result of Toriyama not necessarily being challenged on that and people not really reinforcing to him how important some of this stuff is and why he as a creator, especially when he returned to the franchise, should be way more knowledgeable about what he himself wrote, it has led to what we see in Dragon Ball Super. Because all of these issues have actually compounded upon themselves in the newest iteration of the Dragon Ball franchise, known as Dragon Ball Super, wherein we get to the Dragon Ball Super continuity, and in and of itself, from its very inception, doesn't really fit within the Dragon Ball manga that Akira Toriyama wrote. Because many people don't really know this or have simply forgotten it because it's barely ever mentioned. But Dragon Ball Super isn't actually a continuation of Dragon Ball Z or the Dragon Ball manga. Actually, what it is an interquel. And what I mean by that is an interquel is a story that takes place between two other points in a pre-existing story. So Dragon Ball Super takes place during the time shortly after everyone wished away the memory of Buu on Earth, and before the events of Goku meeting Oob at the end of the tournament. Now, despite the fact that some other YouTubers on this platform have tried to say that Dragon Ball Z is no longer having the end of Z being canon anymore because of the fact that Dragon Ball Super has contradicted it, that actually goes more against Dragon Ball Super and its canonicity and continuity than anything about Dragon Ball Z. Because so many people have been conditioned or have convinced themselves to believe that the end of the Dragon Ball manga, the end of Dragon Ball Z, is not canon. I mean, so many people don't actually even remember that Oob is in Dragon Ball Z, and that's literally how the story ends with Goku and him flying off into the distance at the end. But that is the true primary canon ending of the Dragon Ball story. Now, you can argue maybe it's not the best one, and that maybe the arc before should have been the true canon ending, but nonetheless, that is how everything came to a conclusion. So, as a result, we end up getting this kind of cognitive dissonance between many of the people in the fandom, where so many people have convinced themselves that, oh, they're just retconning it, they're just changing it. But even then, when you have something like this, that is starting from someone's singular creation for the most part, retcons work a little bit differently than they do in Western comics. Because whereas in Western comics, every single story that we see is more of an amalgamation and conglomeration of a number of different writers and editors over the course of decades contributing to stories and runs of those stories, in manga it's different. It's more of a from the bottom up approach, or a top down approach, maybe you could say, where basically everything starts with a singular creation, the manga, and they all go from there. Everything in a trickling down degree of canonicity within the story. And as a result, that's what we've seen in Dragon Ball Super as well, where every time it actually contradicts the Dragon Ball manga, that is not to say that the original Dragon Ball manga is no longer canon, or that many of the things that have occurred within it no longer fit within the primary continuity, but rather that Dragon Ball Super in and of itself, every time it makes a contradiction, every single time that it goes against the true continuity, is actually invalidating its own existence. And you see this all throughout the story, with things like retcons about the Potara fusion, with characters like Pisa showing up near the start of the Dragon Ball Super anime, and people that were only ever in the filler in Dragon Ball Z's anime showing up, or a lot of things that happen in the future Trunks arc, like for example how they reference the Dragon Ball Z special, The History of Trunks, and everything about his story versus the actual version that Akira Toriyama wrote in the manga. And they even changed Trunks' hair color. They changed so many other things throughout the course of Dragon Ball Super, which fans have tried to rationalize for themselves. They say, oh, it still fits because Toriyama drew Trunks' hair color differently. I know, I have the manga. He drew his hair color red one time. That doesn't mean that's what the real canon is as to what his hair color is. Nor does it mean that all of the other contradictions that all add up, all these little things that people love to ignore and write off and say turn off your brain and don't pay attention to, all of them inevitably add up to being a thing that ultimately invalidates the very canon that we see in Dragon Ball Super, at least in terms of it lining up with the continuity of the Dragon Ball manga. So the end of Dragon Ball Z, even if they change it, even if Goku shows up in his orange gi that they love to use because of merchandise reasons, and even if he shows up with blue or Ultra Instinct silver hair to meet Oob, and Oob has God Ki and all these other things that they keep giving him to try and make him relevant, ultimately it's still not going to fit in with the true continuity, and it doesn't retcon or change the original one. It's more establishing itself as being a separate continuity altogether, much like Dragon Ball GT was, following the continuity of the Dragon Ball Z anime, and being its own thing off to the side, which, even though they're promoting it as canon, even though we know that Toriyama has involvement, the truth is that Toriyama's involvement is very, very limited. I mean, when you actually get into it and you read more about what's going on, Toriyama's contributions to Dragon Ball Super are barely anything in the overall scheme. Most of the time, he just sends very brief notes on, like, emails to Toei and to Toyotaro. Even with the Dragon Ball manga, people always talk about, oh, Toriyama's directly working with Toyotaro, and yet Toyotaro is still doing the vast majority of the work. He comes up with a lot of the ideas himself, and Toriyama's involvement are things like corrections and little minor changes, ultimately it's still very far removed. And again, this is Toriyama decades after he finished the Dragon Ball manga and forgot most of everything that happened in it. I mean, the man has said in interviews that he forgot that Super Saiyan 2 or 3 even existed. So again, this is Toriyama after he doesn't even remember his true original narrative intent. Much like you can argue the same thing of George Lucas with the Star Wars prequels when he was making them. And you can argue as a result that everything that Toriyama is involved in, even if he were to go back and redraw and rewrite the entire Dragon Ball Super manga, will never be a part of the same true canon or continuity of the Dragon Ball manga because of the fact that he himself does not remember his mindset, didn't write down notes, and didn't do so many other things that would allow him to truly continue in the same vein that he did before. It will always be a different continuity and a different canon, which in fact means that if we're only applying this to the singular canon, the primary one at least, that everything else spawns from, that Dragon Ball Super, just like Dragon Ball GT, just like Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, the anime, is not canon. It's only canon to its own continuity. And the more you examine Dragon Ball Super, the more you see that it seems like it's just a continuity in and of itself. And again, getting back into the narrative intention, that's another major reason. Because when Toriyama finished the manga in 1995, he was done with everything. He was burnt out, and he had been burnt out really since the end of the Frieza arc. Despite giving us a great arc in the Cell Saga, which really should have been the true ending, which I'm sure I'll get more into in a future video if I actually feel like doing it, the thing is that Toriyama was completely done. He had moved on, and Goku flying away with Oob was meant to be the actual ending of the story. It wasn't meant to be a placeholder. It wasn't meant to set up things that would come in the 10-year gap before that. Every single indication that we got is that during those 10 years, Goku and his family trained together. Maybe he occasionally visited his friends, outside of his house. But Bulma herself showed up and said that it had been 5 years since they had seen each other, which again is completely incompatible with Dragon Ball Super unless they try and argue that it's only been 5 years during the entire series passing, and 5 years from now, somehow everything is going to line back up, which obviously wouldn't make any sense at all. It only go to show you that the Dragon Ball Super continuity is that much more incompatible. Because it was a peaceful time. Toriyama had nothing left to show us, which he even said in his panel at the very end when Goku and Oob are flying away. This is the true canon ending of the story, and everything else that's come afterward or that came before it is still ultimately not doing anything other than building up to that ending. If they go their own way, then we can never consider it to be a part of that same true canon, whether or not Toriyama is involved. And that is ultimately why, when you take all the evidence together, you see that Dragon Ball Super isn't canon. And I know that many people in the comments will probably come to this video and say that I'm just a hater or that I am not a true Dragon Ball fan because I don't like Dragon Ball Super very much. But regardless of my personal feelings, this is more something that is based on more of objective qualifiers. Even if it was 100% canon, I still wouldn't like it and I still wouldn't really want to watch it anymore or read it anymore in the manga. Just because the fact that the quality has never really lived up to the level that it should have, especially since Toei and the other companies involved should have spent those decades in between Dragon Ball GT and the modern renaissance of Dragon Ball learning how to not only hone their craft, but ensure that Dragon Ball Super would live up to the quality of standard that Toriyama created before in his manga, and that they created in the anime in Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. But inevitably, it simply did not. And ultimately, this is no excuse, this is no rationale to keep it inside my head, oh, this isn't canon, this is not. This is just what I think based upon the evidence. But let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Do you agree with this video or disagree? I'm sure I'll see plenty of both, so make sure not to go to war too hard in the comments, though that's certainly inevitable with a topic like this. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.